A very important cultural aspect of Kharakid Kushan Hiigaran society was the Kiithid social system. Unfortunately, I was not able to properly integrate it into my primary anomaly video without severely hampering the narrative flow, so I was forced to leave it out. Normally, I could just say, read the Deserts of Kharak Expedition Guide or the Homeworld Tech Manual for more details, but that feels like a disservice on my part, especially since Kith politics play a more visible role in the story of Deserts of Kharak. Which brings us to here, where I will go into more detail about what is known about this social dynamic and the major Kiithid players in Kharakid Hiigaran history. But there are two disclaimers I need to put out in the open first. 1. The upcoming Homeworld Revelations tabletop game, and possibly Homeworld 3, may add or modify certain aspects of Kith history or even how the system works, and I would rather prefer to get this video out now while my primary anomaly video is still recent-ish. The second is that the Sierra Studios site for Homeworld Cataclysm back in 2000 or 2001 had more supplementary information and history about the Kiithid, which I will be using at points to describe certain Kith. As far as I can tell, this particular lore nugget seemed to have been lost until now, so if you hear something you haven't heard of before, that's probably why. Links to the site are down below. The Kiithid social system, or the Kharakid social system as named by their original Homeworld technical manual, is a social construct that is roughly structured around family groupings called a Kith for singular and Kiithid for plural. All Hiigaran Kharakids are associated with a Kith, big or small. This system is so ingrained in their culture and history that the mere notion of not being tied to a Kith is just unthinkable at best. Each Kith has a hierarchy based on families that have aligned themselves to the Kith. Historically, families at the top of the system were determined by seniority, but as time passed on Kharak, the leading families of a Kith were determined by wealth and personal influence. The leaders of a Kith were one family, referred to as the Kith Sa. When speaking of other Kith Sa, typically a person would use their Kith name followed by the suffix Sa. For example, when speaking of a recent boneheaded decision by, say, the Kith Sa of the Manan, you would refer to them as the Manan Sa. Also, the term Kith Sa could refer to an individual within the Sa family that is recognized as the leader of that family, and by extension the rest of the Kith. However, the role of the Kith Sa is not one of absolute rule, at least not by 1000 KDS. Before, in ancient times on Kharak, the Kith Sa could order the entire Kith to make war on an enemy, but by the modern era, the role of leadership became a more democratic affair. A Kith Sa only had political and financial power only if they acted in accordance with the wishes of the entire Kith through the use of referendums. Below the Kith Sa is typically a secondary family that advises and hears disputes within the Kith. Below this secondary group are the other Kith families, which vary in status. A family's placement within this hierarchy is dependent on the number of members that have pledged allegiance to them. But a family, or a group of families, are not forever bound to be loyal to a specific Kith. While it is considered to be a matter of serious importance and effort, a family can leave and join another Kith, while others can break off entirely and become their own Kith, as was seen with the formation of Kith Lirhra after they left Kith Hral as the Kharakid people were beginning to enter space. As a whole, a Kith will typically concentrate their power base in one or two fields of discipline. One example being Kith Sobon, who originally focused on celestial mechanics and mathematics, then moved on to the study of how the Kharakid originated on Kharak before the discovery of the Kar-Toba, and finally being known for the cutting-edge computer labs and technology by the time of the Kushan mothership. When it comes to the governance of the Hiigaran Kharakids as a whole, the Sa of each Kith would participate in the Diamid, in the capital city of Tyr on Kharak, and then the new capital of Assam Kiithid on Hiigara. There, the Kith Sas would debate policy and settle grievances between Kiithid. While there is no knowledge of how the Kith system worked before the exile, it did exist in some form, as recovered documents found in Hiigara specifically mention the Kith Sa of the Lirhra making a public statement to the Diamid of the time as to how they were to respond to the Galactic Council's demands to relinquish their hyperspace core. Now we move on to each individual Kith, their histories and what makes them unique. The Kiithid listed here are the major players in the Homeworld universe and have documented information. Other Kiithid do exist in Hiigaran Kharakid society, but they vary in size and are often only mentioned by name and never expanded upon. The first and most prolific Kith from our point of view is none other than Kith Sobon. Interestingly, despite their major roles in fighting the Kar-Toba, the Homeworld War, and the Vaegir War, Historically, the Suket never truly seemed to be interested in political power. Instead, this Kith has always focused on science and attempting to find the truth of their existence and the world around them. Some of their most noted developments were the creation of the Kharakid calendar, the only objective accounts of the Heresy Wars, the postulation of the xenogenesis theory, and the biocircuit interface allowing for command and control of the Kushan and Hiigaran motherships. Even during periods of major political upheaval or conflict, no Kith wanted to alienate the Suket as they were seen as too valuable as allies to be dominated by the stronger Kiithid outright. As a matter of fact, any hostile action against the Suket would lead that Kith to be shunned by the science community for a minimum period of 100 years. Opposite from Kith Suket's dedication to knowledge regardless of what it reveals is Kith Galcian, a cult of die-hard religious fanatics who worship Sajuk as a god who punishes the Kharakid for their arrogance over the slightest deviance from the most established rituals and survival methods. The Galcian originally rose to power in the pre-Heresy War eras before 520 KDS, as these beliefs helped keep the Kharakid people alive. However, when the Kharakid began moving into the temperate regions of the Northern Pole, these same beliefs were seen as holding back innovations and improvements of the Kharakid way of life, as again, it was believed that anything that diverged from the orthodox tenets established by the Galcian would risk Sajuk punishing the Kharakid people. While such beliefs appeared to have been mostly abandoned by 1024 KDS, enough people believed in this philosophy of punishment to ignite the Siluman riots of the same year, where the launch of the first orbital flight, the Siluman, was nearly stopped by angry protesters who believed that spaceflight was a waste of resources and would tempt the wrath of Sajuk. This philosophy plays a role again in the narrative for Deserts of Kharak, where it's established that the Galcians have only engaged in their war of the North to prevent divine punishment on all of Kharak. However, by the time of the Homeworld era, the Galcians have mostly fallen into obscurity, but it was documented that Galcian agents were to be blamed for various acts of sabotage on the Mothership project. Whether any Galcians made it to Hiigara during the return is unknown. Similar to the Galcians, although far less zealous, is Kith Sobon, who are also a major player in deciding the societal direction of the Kharakids. One of their most defining beliefs in the ancient era of Kharakid history before 462 KDS was that only they were considered to be of divine origin, and all the other Kiithid were native to Kharak, and were thus considered to be inferior due to corruption by the desert sands. Pejoratively labeled as the Grittidum, or Sand People, by the Sobon, this attitude led to the brutal and oppressive treatment of the other Kiithid. So tyrannical were these Sobon policies that it provoked Kith Paktu's exodus to the southern pole of Kharak. Kith Sobon were also the second major faction in the Heresy Wars, fighting against Kith Galcian over why they were placed on Kharak by Sajuk. When the wars were brought to an end by Kith Nabal and their advanced technology, the Sobon began to step back from their fanatical religious devotion and beliefs of superiority. Eventually, they slowly became more tolerant and progressive along with the rest of Kharakid society. By the modern era of 1000 KDS onward, the Sobon were major contributors to the Northern Coalition of Kiithid, and were often described as looking to the past in order to find answers for the future. But the good reputation of Kith Sobon would be undone when the Sakala, a Sobon-operated carrier, betrayed the Suket carrier Kapisi during Operation Kadim, the mission that led to the discovery of Kar Toba. While the Sakala would eventually be destroyed, what happened after the Kith Sobon was unknown, with no clues as to their eventual fate by the time of the launch of the Kushan mothership in the late 1100s. The most probable scenario would be that since Captain Mashad was most likely under orders to secure the Kar Toba by his Kith Sa, the entirety of the Sobon could have been dissolved, exiled to the desert, or dealt some other large-scale punishment by the other Kiithid. If you don't mind me indulging in speculation a bit, we hear Captain Mashad of the Sakala utter the word Grittidum when speaking of the Galcians when we first meet him in Deserts of Kharak. Upon some reflection, this could have been a subtle hint to those who knew the original lore that maybe the Sobon really were not to be trusted, as the usage of the word could indicate the same beliefs of Sobon exceptionalism that permeated the ancient era, and having not changed in the modern era. While it is possible that the meaning and or usage of Grittidum changed over the centuries, much like how meanings change in our world, the Sobon did eventually betray the Coalition. Or maybe I'm overthinking about all of that. Well, it's something to consider at the very least. Moving to the southern pole of Kharak, we find Kith Paktu. As stated previously, the Paktu were once a Kith under the Sobon who became angry at the near constant oppression of their liege Kith and made an exodus to the south. This was a far more dangerous a trek than anyone could surmise at face value. Keep in mind that most of the land between the northern and southern poles of Kharak consisted almost entirely of scorching desert, not to mention the fact that there was no verifiable evidence that there was habitable land in the south, as the only reports of such were Kharakid from Kith Paktu who had been driven mad by their travels. Compounding matters more was that Kith Paktu's level of technology in 488 KDS required them to use sail-driven sand ships to make the journey. But given a life of oppression by the Sidim on one side and the Galcians on the other, the Paktu saw at the time, Magerian Paktu, committed his Kith to find a new home in the south. They would, quite literally, live free or die. This first migration cost the Paktu greatly. By the time they reached the Hunan Mountains, only 17 families were left. As they trekked further south through the mountains, the travelers began to despair. But Magerian Paktu never gave up, and spoke a line that would live forever in their Kith's history. "I can smell the sea. It's only a little farther." Of course, the others did not believe him, but at that exact moment a bird appeared, circling the sun. Believing this was a sea spirit, they pressed on, following the bird, which led them to what would eventually be called the Magerian Sea, named after their Paktu Sa. Over the course of the centuries, the Paktu would build their homes by the sea, and send expeditions back to the north to inform those left behind that they could live free from tyranny if they joined Kith Paktu in the south. News of this would reach both the Galcians and the Sidim, which led to them attempting 3 major crusades to bring their prodigal sons and daughters back into the fold, but never with any success. The southern pole of Kharak would remain under the leadership of Kith Paktu well up until the launch of the Kushan mothership, their people retaining their strong beliefs in independence and their loathing of priests and despots. In situations when things seem darkest, a Paktu can always be heard saying their Kith's motto, "I can smell the sea." The situation in the north would eventually change, and the heresy wars would be brought to an end by Kith Nabal, a mysterious Kith that lived in a hidden valley of the north called Tyr, keeping to themselves and staying out of Kiithid affairs. Instead, they focused on gaining knowledge and developing their society. It wasn't until late 700 KDS did Ifrit Nabal rise to the position of Kith Sa. Seeing that the ongoing wars would eventually cause the extinction of all Kharakid, he proposed to his Kith that they raise an army to put an end to the destructive conflicts. This proposal would be widely accepted by the Nabal and preparations would soon begin. Despite Kith Nabal's presumably far smaller numbers compared to the Galcians or Sidim, the Nabal had several technological advantages in their favor, such as steam-powered vehicles, explosives, cannons, firearms, and body armor, none of which was ever seen on Kharak up until that point. With their vast array of superior technology, their army won every engagement with the other Kith, and once a village or city was liberated, it was said that Ifrit Nabal Sa himself would speak to the populace and offer them the benefits of Nabal's science if they laid down their arms and stopped the fighting. The lesser Kiithid, tired on to death by the brutal wars, gratefully accepted. Before long, the Nabal army had grown to 50 times its size from when they first left their valley. In 3 short years from when they started, the heresy wars were over. Ifrit Nabal Sa's final act before relinquishing his leadership of the Kith was the establishment of the Diamid in Tyr, the home city of the Nabal. There, Kiithid both great and small would convene to resolve conflicts and lead Kharak. In the decades and centuries to follow, Kith Nabal set about repairing the damaged infrastructure from the heresy wars, and even created steam car rail lines to the southern pole, allowing for Kith Paktu to partake in the Diamid. Kith Nabal's position in Kharakid politics would remain relatively unchanged up until the launch of the Kushan mothership, and would become a major power in the new Diamid established on Hiigara after the Homeworld War. Now we come to Kith Paktu, perhaps considered to be the strangest group in the eyes of Kharakid society. They vary wildly in their physical appearance and are known for maintaining a nomadic existence, which historically was seen as an affront to the decent morals and values of the Kharakid. This attitude would make sense in context, as when the Kharakid were struggling to maintain their existence through farming in Kharak's early history, the Manan shunned such a lifestyle in favor of traveling from place to place. The other Kiithid's attitudes were cemented when quote-unquote stories of farms along the White Desert had been raided by the Manani after being denied the ability to camp on their lands. With the perspective of history, however, this story proved to be very dubious for a variety of reasons. But nonetheless, this tale came to be widely believed by the Kiithid, tainting the image of the Mnani for hundreds of years. And yet, Kith Mnan were still regularly welcomed into the holds of other Kiithid, as there was something they could provide that was not typically found in the often harsh desert life: entertainment. While the Mnani always considered themselves traders, they were never able to compete with the legitimate trade routes among the northern Kiithid. Instead, they focused on music, laughter, and spectacle so that they could share, and profit from, their talents with the other Kharakids. This way of life for Kith Mnan would continue up until some point during the Heresy Wars, as their freewheeling, often boisterous love of life came into conflict with the strict religious doctrines of the Galcian Sidim. These tensions would come to a head in 513 KDS, when the Mnani held their annual gathering in a region known as Ferran Shah. Leading an army into the grounds, the Sidim slaughtered the Mnani as they were reveling in celebration. The survivors of this massacre regrouped and swore revenge. Taking up their swords, they sailed on their standcraft to harass Sidim holdings bordering the desert. Whereas once the sight of Kith Mnan's colors were a cause for celebration and mirth, now it only brought terror and panic. However, this blood feud would end in 656, when the Great Mother of Mnan declared their war with the Sidim to be over. Soon after, their pirate fleet would be converted into trade ships, and the Mnani would re-establish a new Ferran Shah festival in the Paktu-held southern pole. By the time the Homeworld War began, Kith Mnan had managed to amass considerable wealth, and most often were known for producing statesmen or diplomats. But the nomadic spirit and hunger for new experiences still remain with the Mnani. Often they can be seen piloting scoutcraft or new and experimental vehicles. Also in the category of unorthodox Kiithid is Kith Sobon, which has always been a Kith dedicated to the martial disciplines as warriors and mercenaries. Their origins as a group are quite fascinating, and started in or around 416 KDS. Although the exact details are hazy, their history records that they were originally a vassal Kith that were invaded by temple men of a stronger nearby Kith. While they were able to repel the invasion, the stronger Kith returned in force and slaughtered almost every man, woman, and child, forcing the survivors to flee across the sparkling desert to report this atrocity to their Kith Sa. The leader of these survivors was a Kharakid named Sobon the Red, who recounted the tale of their flight to his Kith Sa, demanding vengeance upon their enemies and offering to lead the counterattack. But the Kith Sa refused. While their reasoning was unknown, it's assumed they either feared repercussions or the enemy Kith was seen as too strong to challenge. Outraged by this inaction, Sobon and his followers tore the colors of their Kith from their bodies in shame and declared themselves no longer of the Kith. They then took on a new color, blood red, followed by a return to their homes to exact the vengeance they sought. When the battle was over, it was said that not even a single blade of grass was left green, and not one stone was left standing on top of another. This act would cement their reputation for ferocity in the coming years. From their founding and up until the 1100s, the Sobon refused to use standard family groupings for themselves, keeping in line with Sobon the Red's beliefs that the only ones worthy of the word Kith were those who were Kith in spirit. As such, no marriage was permitted within the Kith, and any child born within the Sobon are either left with other Kiithid, or their parents are forced to leave the Sobani. Also unique among the Kiithid is that they were landless on Kharak. Instead, the Sobani focused their existence on being mercenaries, taking part in every military conflict in Kharak's recorded history since their founding. The Sobon were so well regarded in any and all military affairs that virtually all Kushan military leadership by the time of the mothership launch were trained at Sobon-run academies. But the Sobon were not the only ones to reject tradition. Kith Haral was formed when 5 former Kith Sa leaders saw their Kiithid decimated in the chaos of the Heresy Wars. These leaders met in a tent outside of Tyr and decided that tradition and the old rules had failed them utterly. Vowing to themselves that they would no longer submit to the old system, the families elected a new Sa and called themselves the Haral. Initially spurned by the Nabal and the Sidim, the Haral would eventually be recognized as a legitimate Kith in their newly formed Diamid thanks to popular support. However, the Sidim continued to challenge their legal status and were eventually on the brink of succeeding in getting the Haral disbanded. It was not until Stel Haral Sa was touring the Nabal ironworks did she come to a revelation. As she was watching Sajet technicians and Nabal artisans argue with how to manufacture a Nabal steam car, she realized that the differences between the two Kiithid made cooperative efforts difficult. While the Haral could not challenge the Sujet's knowledge or the Nabal's mechanical skill, there was one thing that her Kith could surpass them on: a desire to work together. The Haral Saw then purchased the rights to manufacture the Nabal steam car under license. At the end of the next triad of that year, the Kith Saws of the Nabal and Sujet were invited to witness 40 Haral workers assemble 3 steam cars in one day, whereas it would have taken them 1 month to complete. The members of Kith Haral had broken down a complex task into a series of relatively simple ones. In the following year, the Haral created an industrial revolution and rose to become a manufacturing powerhouse by the time of the mothership launch. However, by 1012 KDS, Arbin Haral, the Saw of a small Kith aligned with the Haral, disagreed with the direction of Kith Haral and argued that the future was in aerospace technologies. The Haral Saws dismissed these claims as there seemed to be no short-term profit in the venture. Angered by the Haral Saw's unwillingness to change, Arbin gathered other Haral-aligned Kiithid who also believed in the future of aerospace, and petitioned Kith Manan for an extremely large loan for them to become an independent Kith, and pay for the manufacturing assets to be purchased from the Haral. Sima Manan Saw was amused by this proposal, and after appraising their members and the equipment to be bought, agreed to a low-interest loan of 500 million credits. But Kith Haral was less than pleased by this turn of events. They immediately moved to banish Arbin from the Kith, preventing him from taking any family members or assets, and a seizure of his holdings in which the Manani loan was held. In addition, any family that was known to support Arbin Haral's movement were held indefinitely, awaiting interviews by the Haral Saw. When Arbin demanded an audience with the Kith Saw as to why they were holding his people, he was forced out by Haral security, taken out to the Painted Desert, and tied to a stake 200 clicks from the nearest town. But Arbin would not be beaten into submission. He escaped and traveled a long distance to the nearby city of Freen, where he enlisted the help of his Kith brother, Kona Haral. After he was able to recover from his long trek through the desert, he traveled to the Diamid in Tyr by hopping aboard a freight car. Arriving at the Diamid assembly in a ragged and unkempt state, no one believed that this wild man was Arbin Lihra Saw, and that the Haral were keeping his people prisoner. But as the Sobani guardsmen moved to take him away, Sima Manan Saw rose from her seat to greet Arbin, saying, "Welcome, Lihra Saw. We wondered what had happened to you." Now, with the open backing of the Manani, the Diamid voted to grant Lihra their independence. The Haral were punished for their mistreatment of this new Kith, and were forced to part with the Lihra at a far lower price than what the Manan appraised. To add insult to injury, the Haral Saw would then be deposed by his sister some time after. The newly founded Kith Lihra would quickly become the forerunners in the Kiithid's aerospace industry, being critical contributors to every single aspect of the mothership's construction. But their story does not end there. After the Hiigaran landfall, in an ironic twist of fate, the survivors of Kith Haral found themselves struggling to maintain a voice for themselves in the new Diamid. Eventually tiring of fighting uphill, they joined Kith Lihra as vassals. From the youngest Kith to one of the oldest are Kith Kalel, who started from humble beginnings as poor travelers, but their luck would improve when they entered a trade deal with Kith Sujet, feeding grounds for their animals to graze on in exchange for 10 yearling hides for writing. Years would pass and both Kiithid would profit from this arrangement. In the spirit of mutual benefit, the Kalel Saw made a bold request, asking the Sujet Saw to allow the Kalel to become their vassals. The Saw agreed. But before the Kalel could take the Sujet name, they would have to serve for 3 generations as Sujet initiates. In the first generation, the Kalel proved to be good students in the ways of Sujet, such as reading, mathematics, and writing. When their training was complete, they would be sent to remote Kiithid to work as scribes and messengers. Eventually, their reputations in these roles became so prominent that other Kiithid would ask for them by name. The Kalel were seemingly determined to not fail their Kith Saw and lose their chance of becoming full members of Kith Sujet. By the second generation, Kith Kalel's influence grew as the Sujet gave their children a more refined education, which included philosophy, history, and politics. One of these children was Lear Kalel, son of the current Kalel Saw, who was being groomed to take up his mother's position. When she died in 33-7, Lear rose to the position of Saw and began consolidating his Kith. Calling a gathering in the Walking Dunes, he discussed his plans for the future, a separation of themselves from the Sujet. The details about the how and why are somewhat unclear, but the separation of the two Kiithid was bloodless, yet still left a bitter taste in both. Over the next 50 years, the Kalel would become leaders in communications, documentation, and even encryption. Eventually, Kith Kalel would evolve into a small yet powerful clan of information specialists, being employed as historians, writers, and even spies and assassins by the time of the Heresy Wars. Near the end of the wars, and with the rise of Kith Nabal, the Kalel became a vassal of Nabal. Their roles were to be as heralds for the Nabal armies, traveling ahead to the cities and villages to recommend they surrender. As a matter of fact, the Kalel were so successful with this task that the Nabal actually accredited them for avoiding a far greater amount of bloodshed. By 857 KDS, Kith Kalel broke off from the Nabal to become independent once again. Taking what they learned from the Nabal, they unveiled a new invention to the Kharakid people: the printing press. With this revolutionary development, the Kalel's influence exploded as publishing became a lucrative profession, which in turn encouraged more Kharakid to learn how to read and write. Eventually, they would continue to specialize in communications and information, investing in television stations, satellites, and even the majority of sensors and comm arrays on the mothership herself. Even the mothership's fleet intelligence during the Homeworld War consisted mainly of Kalel members. After the Hiigaran landfall, they would rise to become prominent members of the new Diamid, as almost half their Kith were sleepers aboard the mothership. Kith Kalel would eventually move on to become a well-regarded warrior Kith as the new Hiigarans fought to secure their home in the post-Homeworld War era. One of the legacies of the Heresy Wars was the disillusionment of many small Kiithid and Kharakid society, religion, and anything resembling the rule of law. The cause for this attitude was simple: the Sidim and their dogma that declared all other Kiithid Grittidim. Unwilling to live under the Sidim as second-class citizens, many fled to Kith Galcian, while others gave up everything that made Kharakid society what it was, and would journey out into the desert, never to be seen again. Curiously though, even after the wars ended and the Age of Reason began, some Kiithid still wandered out into the desert to disappear. It wasn't until 1024 when a cryptographer named Masar Manan was deciphering Galcian code words did he come across two words of interest, the first being Fagan, which was eventually determined to be the Galcian word for the coalition Kiithid, its rough translation being blind followers of a false god. But the second word in the reports hinted at something more: Khanef. Believing that this word may imply another hostile faction out in the deserts, Masar brought his findings to his coalition superiors, who simply scoffed at his report, and even went as far as to imply his beliefs were influenced by his Manani heritage, and the old tales of monsters that rode with the storm. But Masar was a trained linguist, and fought with the coalition intelligence leadership over his data, and eventually he was placed in charge of a task force in 1026 to investigate this unknown player in the Kharakid landscape. Inevitably, his investigations came upon the meaning of the word Khanef. It turned out to be a very ancient word that had a direct translation to godless. In the Galcian belief system, if the ties that bind the Kharakid together was a rope, then these desert people had severed that connection with a knife, as they were a group who believed in nothing except survival. This made them a people with the souls of beasts, or in another word, Khanef. The idea of a people who believed in absolutely nothing was an utterly foreign idea to the Galcian, and when word reached them that the Northern Coalition was investigating these Khanef, the Galcian saw discreetly shared certain records with Masar's task force. Eventually, 3 years later, he was able to piece together their history. The Kharakids that were exiled out into the deserts did not all die, but instead survived by looting battlefields and eventually warring with each other and raiding small fringe settlements and unsuspecting caravans. Nothing was spared. The only reason how the Galcians knew of their existence were by the continual attacks from the Khanef. Very little else was known about them, but they were increasing in strength by the time Operation Kadim was set to launch. Coalition strategists of the time believed a direct conflict with the Khanef was an almost certainty, but whether that prediction became reality before the launch of the Kushan mothership is unknown. Now finally, we come to the last, but perhaps the most popular Kith, Kith Somta. Before they were known as the Beast Slayers, the Somta were an ancient lineage for over 1,000 years on Kharak that were based in a region called the Kontala mountain range. Their Kith was prosperous and self-sufficient and became rich in trade. But the crowning achievement for which Kith Somta was known for was the Shimmering Path, a collection of 33 temples built into a mountain known as Lungma Jin, the roof of the world. There, the Kharakids of other Kiithid would make a pilgrimage to test the strength of their faith by visiting each temple along the path. But their status as a religious Kith would not last, and the Somta would be forced to evolve into a mining Kith due to what was to come: the Heresy Wars. As the conflict between the Sidim and Gaussian escalated, Kith Somta began to suffer heavily, as much of their economy was based on pilgrims donating to the temples along the Shimmering Path. But with the ongoing conflict, these same pilgrims trickled down to almost nothing. But the Somta were able to stay out of the Heresy Wars and keep their lands independent, thanks to a combination of the mountainous terrain of their holdings and their own stubbornness. But this was a double-edged sword, as the Somta were effectively isolated from the rest of Karak. In 789, Kura Somta received a strange dream where Sajuk drove a great red sword into the Kontala Mountains, in a remote region far away from the main roads called Red Creek Valley. Believing this to be a vision, she took several Somta families with her to retrace the path Sajuk laid out for her. While no one was sure what they would find at Red Creek, their prize revealed itself to the Somta soon enough after some hard digging. Their reward for answering Sajuk's call was none other than the richest deposit of iron ore ever seen on Karak. Instead of selling this gift from Sajuk to either the Gaussian or Sidim, they built great smelters that created some of the finest high-grade steel. With this, the Somta then struck a deal with Kith Sobon. In exchange for their metal, the Sobon would agree to a contract that kept the Kassar Passage leading into Somta territory open and free from marauders for over 100 years. From that point on, the Somta would continue to expand and fully embrace their new role as miners. While they never produced technological advances on their own, they were always quick to utilize new tools and methods. However, all of this was but a prelude to what the Somta would achieve in the post-Hiigaran landfall during the Beast War. The story of how they rose from a smaller Kith that was looked down upon by the other Kiithid to the heroes of the galaxy would require an entirely separate video. Oh, will we get to that tale in due time. The Hiigaran Kharakids are a diverse people with a rich culture and history. A fact that can sometimes be easy to forget in the voids of space or across the sprawling deserts. Even with such a vast history behind them, they will never stop forging their own path into the future.